Hello class, for today I'm going to go over the quiz review. You will see the three components of trigonometric graphing. They would be amplitude, frequency, slash period, and vertical shift. You have been doing questions where you have been dealing with amplitude and frequency from yesterday. I'm only going to add one more component for today, which is vertical shift, which wouldn't involve, which wouldn't be so bad in not mixing all these three things together. Now, the tricky part is to add your last part to it, which is your phase shift. But that will be the last part for the trigonometric graphing. And once you're able to do all of these four things combined, then we're pretty much done with graphing any type of trigonometric functions out there. I'm going to go over three questions for today, and you will see three questions for quiz tomorrow as well, just like you will be seeing on these guys. So, I'm going to ask you to identify for me all of these different components that makes a trigonometric function. Now, for this purpose of these questions, you will not be doing phase shift for any of these questions. Okay, but you will eventually get to that. So, take a look at question number one. If you guys would like to pause the video and plot the graph first and then check the answer, that's fine. But I am going to go over the answer now. The amplitude here is always identified by the first number in the trigonometric function. The frequency here would just be 1 over 3 because that's the value in front of the x. The new period, the formula is always 2 pi divided by b, which means I'm going to be using my answer from number 2 to help solve for this problem, which would mean it's 2 pi over 1 over 3. Well, dividing by 1 over 3 means it's multiplying by 3, which means 6 pi. Then each increment, I'm going to use this to help me solve for the answer. It's always a new period divided by 4. Every increment, therefore, I'm going to make it as 3 pi over 2. Vertical shift is the very last component of this graph, which means I'm moving by -1. Now, first, identify all of these things. You will get points for every single one of these components. Then, what's my next step? I have to draw my frame. Do not forget to draw the frame for every trigonometric functions. I want to see that. You should first start with vertical shift. So I start at -1. Then I go down 3, 1, 1, 2, 3. And I go up 3, 1, 2, 3. Because those are my amplitudes, so they'll be at maximum, this will be at middle, and this will be minimum. So now I have my framework that incorporates the amplitude and vertical shift. So I kind of eliminated them just to get them out of the way. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to label my increment. I like to, if I'm given this grid, I like to make each two increments to be the 3 pi over 2. So that's 3 pi over 2. That's 6 pi over 2, which means it's 3 pi. And this is going to be 4.5 pi, so that's what? 7 pi over 2? No, 9 pi over 2, right? And then the last one will be 6 pi. You can see how this, after 1, 2, 3, 4 increments, it should match with the new period that you have wrote up there. If I go in the opposite direction, I'm going to just copy and paste that. Please make sure that you make each increment uniformed so that you do not, you don't go here and say that's 9 pi over 2. It's down here, it's -9 pi over 2, and it's -6 pi. Of course, you can do one more, but it doesn't really matter. That, to be more precise, that'll be 15 pi over 2, -15 pi over 2. Okay? Now, that's done. New period is established. Frequency, there's really no need for that. So I've established all these things. Now, once the framework is ready, once the increments are set, then you just need to do the alternating mid, max, and min. You just need to alternate amongst those three. But you need to identify where you're starting. Now, if it's cosine, you know that you start at max. If it's negative cosine, you start at min. For sine and negative sine, you know they both start at middle, but the second starting point is at max, and then this is at min. So, if I'm using cosine, I need to start at max, at 0. So I'm going to start here. Then my next step is for each increment that I go to, oh, that's not where I should be. I go to mid because that's the line for where the midline is. Min, mid, max, mid, minimum, mid, max, and then back to mid. Oh, I'm sorry, this point should not be here. It should be here, and that's mid. So if I were to plot the graph, I would plot it so, and then there's my graph right there. Now what I'm really checking to see is that your increment is correct, that you have established your framework of max, mid, and min, and that all of the points are located on the correct spot, those 5 essential points. When I say essential points, I mean mid, min, and max, like those 3. Okay, that's all I want to see. I don't need to see each of these points in between, like there's no need for that, okay? I just need to see a rough sketch of it. Okay, so let's try doing 2 more questions here. Now try taking a look at this, and now this one you have to make your grid on your own. Pause the video and get the answers and check with me afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to fly through these really quickly. Amplitude is 5 and frequency is 6. New period would be pi over 3, so each increment would be pi over 12. Well, how did I get pi over 3? It's 2 pi divided by 6, right? So vertical shift here will be just positive 2. Now, I'm going to be using this grid, and then, so if I know that the amplitude is 2 and the vertical shift is 2, I mean, amplitude is pretty big, so I probably want to make my y scale to be just a little bit small. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because I know it goes all the way up to 7. And then starting at 2, I go down 5, which would end up at -3. So I know my framework where it needs to be. It's going to start at positive 2, and it's going to end up at positive 7, and it's going to, ooh, that was pretty bad. It's going to end at -3. You know, give or take, you know, that's a good grid, right? So that's max, that's mid, and that's minimum. Okay, so now I have established those framework now. Now each increment is what I need to do. So I'm going to make each x scale to be pi over 12. So pi over 12, pi over 6, what's that, 3 pi over 12, so it's pi over 4, and that's pi over 3. If you're wondering how am I getting these numbers, like if that seems confusing, just go 2 pi over 12, 3 pi over 12, 4 pi over 12, and if you reduce it, you'll get those numbers. And you can see how 4 pi over 12 is the same as 5 pi over 3, so that's when my one of the cycle will happen. But I'm going to do more cycles here, just to show you. 5 pi over 12, 6 pi over 12, 7, oh, not 17, 7 pi, that's 7 pi over 12, and that's 8 pi over 12. Same thing happens on the other end, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 12, -2 pi over 12, -3 pi over 12, -4 pi over 12, -5, -6, -7, -8. You see how it's really crucial that you get really super organized with this, otherwise you won't be able to graph trigonometric functions pretty well. So now I have established the increment. I'm going to use a little bit thicker one. I've established my increment. I've established the vertical shift, the new period and frequency, that's all given, and then amplitude is all established. So now I'm done. I'm having sign negative. Negative sign starts at middle, and then it goes to minimum for my second point. So I'm going to go to my middle. Then at the next increment, which is a pi over 12, I'm going to go to min, mid, max, mid, min, mid, max, mid. So there's my one wave, there's my second wave. So you see how there's 2 waves in 8 pi over 12, because this right here, halfway through, this should be one cycle, and this should be one cycle, in which it totally makes sense. Then I go to the other end, so this one will be max, mid, min, mid, max, mid, min, mid. So I'm going to go like this, and there's my wave right there. Again, I'm checking the frame, make sure it's established. If you don't establish that, I'm not going to give you points. Second one is the increment, the x scale. So each of these increments are established. 3, plot correctly. because that really has to deal with this. Do you understand the pattern, where it starts for negative sign, negative cosine? It might be good to write down the notes for that. So let me write that down for you here. So for sine, negative sine, cosine, negative cosine. Sine is mid, max, mid, min, and then mid. Negative sign is mid, min, mid, max, and then middle. So sine always has multiple mids, so those 5 essential points. So this happens at 0. The first increment, second increment, third increment, and then fourth increment, okay? For cosine, you start always at max, mid, min, mid, and then back to max. So your starting value should always end up being the same. And then for negative cosine, you start at minimum, mid, max, mid, and then min. Again, starting and the end point is the same. Okay. All right, last question. For this one also, make sure you guys pause the video and try this on your own. Oh, by the way, I can write that down for you like that. I could write, sine of x plus d, or I could write d plus sine of x. They mean the same thing. So this should be your vertical shift if you're confused about that. Okay, assuming that you're done, I'm going to go through these quickly. Amplitude is 2, frequency is 5, new period is 2 pi divided by 5, which makes each increment to be pi over 10, or 2 pi over 20 if you will, but if you reduce it, it's just pi over 10. All right, so let's establish the framework here. So I'm going to be using a little bit of a smaller thickness. Vertical shift is at positive 1. Amplitude is 2. So I'm going to reach positive 3, negative 1. So max, mid, and min. My number 1 step is done. My framework is established. Then my next step is to make each increment to be pi over 10, which means I'm going to make this to be pi over 10, 2 pi over 10, 3 pi over 10, and then 4 pi over 10, which is the same thing as saying 2 pi over 5, because if you reduce it, it's 2 pi over 5. Then I can, of course, do one more, but I'm just going to leave it as it is. So the other direction, negative pi over 10, negative 2 pi over 10, negative 3 pi over 10, and negative 4 pi over 10. Number 2 step, establish the increment, finished. My last step is to now draw the dots and connect them. It's sine, and it's positive sine, which means I'm going to be using this. I start mid, max, mid, min, mid. So I'm going to start at middle, max, mid, min, and then mid. Other way around. Draw the wave. Do I have to complete this part and this part if that's your question? No, it doesn't matter. As long as you show me this two full cycles, each increment is the same, and the amplitude is if the framework is correct, I'll give you full credit for it. Okay, hope this video helps. Make sure you finish the review for today and submit it by 11:59 p.m. today, and that'll be it. Tomorrow you will take your quiz. No homework over the weekend as before. Thank you and have a good day.